Old Testament, Lesson 11. How can I do this great wickedness? A quote from Joseph while he was in Egypt. And for the lesson, a lot of times when you look at the manual, there might just be a couple of scriptures in there. There might be no scriptures occasionally, not very often, but sometimes. But this time, if you look at Lesson 11 in the Old Testament manual, there's a lot of scriptures, and full chapters, and so it's there was a lot to cover in this lesson. And in the manual, it looks at those scriptures and it focuses on um, really immorality and chastity issues that are going on in there. But to start off with, I'd like to have a couple of quotes here. Here's one from Brigham Young. It says, "Do you read the scriptures, my brethren and sisters, as though you were writing them 1,000, 2,000, or 5,000 years ago? Do you read them as though you stood in the place of the men who wrote them?" And then a more recent one from Dallin H. Oaks. "We should judge the actions of our predecessors on the basis of the laws and commandments and circumstances of their day, not ours." So, in light of these two quotes and in looking at the scriptures that the manual has, I don't necessarily think we should judge them on the moral standards and rules and laws around sexuality that we have today. It's not really fair, and it's not even really the point of the story in many cases. When you read it, if you look at the culture of the day and the Hebrew stories that are surrounding it, um, it's taking it out of context for the most part. So I'm taking a little bit of a different tact here, but if you read through pretty much the same stories in the manual, you follow all the same scriptures, but you look at it a different way. There's this common thread, this theme that goes through all of these chapters that I think is very relevant to us today, and also to what happened back then to them, and um, that is deception. Um, Deception is the act or practice of deceiving someone by concealing or misrepresenting the truth, or using a small portion of the truth and some lies, or a large portion of the truth and a little bit of lies mixed in. And as we look through the scripture readings in the lesson, we find that there's this trail of deception that spans generations, um, that is interesting. It's something that we can look into and ponder on and learn from. So as we go through the scriptures um, for this lesson, I'm going to focus on this trail of deception, this common thread that follows through all of these stories. And we start off with Jacob deceiving Isaac. It's kind of Rebekah's idea, at least it appears that way in the text. But in Genesis chapter 22, or chapter 25, I mean, verses 22 through 28, we read, this is Rebekah, Isaac's husband, or wife. Isaac is her husband. And it says, it's talking about Rebekah conceiving, and it says, "And the children struggled together within her, and she said, If it be so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said unto her, Two nations are in thy womb, and two manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. And the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. And when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red, all over like a hairy garment, and they called his name Esau. And after that came his brother out, and his hand took hold on Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 80 years old when she bare them. And the boys grew, and Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field, and Jacob was a plain man dwelling in tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So here we see, Rebekah has twins. God tells her the older will serve the younger, and Isaac loves the older, and Rebekah loves the younger. So if the elder is going to serve the younger, there appear to be two obstacles to that. First, as the older child, Esau has the birthright. Second, since Isaac favors Esau, he's likely to give him his dying prophetic blessing, right? Now, the first obstacle there is overcome when a famished Esau foolishly sells his birthright to Jacob. Uh, but that leaves us with the second problem. Isaac loves Esau. And we see in Genesis 27, Isaac appears to think he's going to die. Um, and he tells Esau to go out, go hunting, and prepare him some venison that he loves, and he'll bless him. But Rebekah overhears that. And rather to leave this to God to sort out, Rebekah initiates a plan of deception. And so while Esau is out hunting, she goes and gets Jacob, tells him to get two young kids, or goats, I guess, so she can make the food that Isaac is expecting. And on top of that, she gets some of Esau's best clothes, puts them on Jacob so that he will smell, um, presumably like animals, but maybe like Esau. And then she takes the skins of the young goats and puts them on Jacob's arms and his neck so that he'll be hairy. And then Jacob goes in to Isaac to deceive him to get the blessing. And Isaac um, recognizes him as Jacob. He says, well, wait a minute, you sound like Jacob. You don't sound like Esau. What's going on? Apparently something was going on with Isaac's eyes. I guess he couldn't see at the time. But at any rate, um, Jacob successfully deceives Isaac and receives the blessing, which, of course, upset Esau quite a bit. And Esau planned to kill Jacob. He was waiting for Isaac to die, but he was not quiet about the fact that Jacob had wronged him and would die. So Rebekah sends him to live with her brother, his uncle Laban, and shortly after arriving there, he falls in love with Laban's younger daughter, and offers 7 years of service to Laban in exchange for her hand in marriage. So 7 years goes by. Jacob gives Laban the service. After 7 years, they do this big wedding feast, right? And presumably, Jacob's bride had a full face veil on, something like this maybe. And so they get married. They go into the marriage tent, do their thing. Jacob wakes up the next morning, and he's like, wait a minute. This is Leah. This isn't Rachel. And so he goes to Laban and says, you deceived me. And in the text, interestingly enough, when you go back to the original sources, the wording used to describe Laban's deceit is derived from the noun that had earlier been used to describe Jacob's deceit of his brother Esau, suggesting that what goes around comes around, right? Jacob had deceived Esau, and now he was being deceived by Laban. Should be noted he does get Rachel as well. Uh, Within a week, there's a week-long marriage feast for his marriage to Leah. Right after that, he marries Rachel, but he does need to give Laban another 7 years of service for Rachel. So now he's worked for Laban for 14 years. After that, he stays with Laban another 6 years. Um, working for him. So it's been about 20 years now that he's been with Laban, and the situation starts to change. Laban's sons begin to speak harshly towards Jacob, saying that Jacob is, stealing their father's wealth. Even Laban appears to be treating Jacob a little bit differently. And so Jacob decides it's time for him to go. He claims to have been deceived by Laban, and he waits for Laban to be gone, out of town on a business trip, as it were, and he takes his family and leaves. Takes Leah and Rachel and all his servants and everything else, and they leave. While they're packing up to go, Rachel steals her father's idols and packs them away. And then as they leave, Laban gets word that Jacob has left. He gathers together a bunch of his men and lays chase to Jacob. And it takes him about 7 days, but he catches up to him. And he says, "Why did you split? Why did you take off without saying anything?" Jacob says, "Well, I thought, you wouldn't let me take your daughters and whatever." And Laban's like, "Come on. That's not the way it would have worked." But the real question here is, why did you steal my idols? And Jacob says, "What? You're accusing me or somebody with me of being a thief?" And Jacob doesn't know that Rachel stole them, and says, "Search everywhere, and if you find him, we'll put that person to death. Whoever stole from you will be put to death." Uh, so he's searching for his idols, and Rachel sticks them in some furniture and then sits on it. And as Laban comes in her tent to search, she says, "Oh, I can't get up because I'm, I'm in the way of the woman," or however she words it, I forget. But she had the idol, she sat on them, she had deceived both her husband and her father about that. Eventually, Laban doesn't find him and he goes his own way. Interestingly enough, it's been 20 years since Jacob deceived Esau, since Isaac thought he was going to die and blessed him. And yet it's at this point, as he's leaving, that um, Jacob runs into Esau. Things work out okay. But it's after they're back together again that Isaac dies. So um, Isaac lived another 20 plus years after he gave the blessing to um, Jacob. But anyways, Jacob goes off with his family. They are living elsewhere. He has his sons, and he has one daughter named Dinah. And there's a prince in a nearby clan named Shechem who, from all appearances, rapes Dinah, but then um, says that he loves her and wants to be with her. He wants to marry her. And he gets his father involved, and his father and him go and are trying to convince everybody that their intentions are pure and that they want to marry her. They want to be friends. They want to trade, whatever. And so Simeon and Levi, two of Jacob's sons, say that uh, they can't um, they can't marry her unless they're circumcised, and that these guys won't trade and won't, associate with uncircumcised people. So if they get them and all of their men who go out of the city, all their men of fighting age, I guess, or if they all get um, circumcised, then they can have Dinah for wife, and they'll trade and create alliances. If not, then they're going to take Dinah and leave. And so uh, Shechem and his father convince all the men of the city to get circumcised, believing that that's what needs to happen in order for them to marry Dinah and be allies with Jacob's clan. But after they all get circumcised, then Simeon and Levi go in and slaughter them all. And not only do they slaughter them all, but they carry off their wives and their children. So ostensibly, they're doing this because Shechem raped Dinah, and yet they're doing the exact same thing to all of Shechem's people. Uh, and we can get into that more, but again, that's something that we could talk about the immorality or the chastity issues here, but it's more cultural because obviously they didn't have a problem um, doing it to him, but they had a problem when he did it to them. So there's some cultural nuances there that we won't get into. But Jacob's pretty upset about this. It forces them to move, uh, and in the future, actually, you see Jacob refer back to this. Many years in the future, you see him refer back to this. He hasn't gotten over it, and he distrusts Levi and Simeon because of their actions here. Their deception and their violence causes them to lose out potentially on their father's trust and things that could have come to them for many years to come. So, a little while after this, uh, Jacob, he has Joseph, who's his favorite son, whatever, and the rest of the brothers are out a couple days away, a couple days journey away, taking care of sheep and the flocks and whatever. And Jacob sends Joseph to check on him, and the brothers see him coming from afar off, and they're pretty upset with him. At this point, he's had the dreams. He said they will bow to him. He's their father's favorite son, gets all the special privileges and the extra gifts. And so his brothers see him coming from afar off and decide they're going to kill him. They're tired of dealing with him. Now's their chance. They're going to kill him. Reuben, who's the oldest, convinces them not to kill him, just to throw him down in a dry well. And then his plan is he'll come back at a later point and rescue him and take him back to Jacob. So they say, okay, we'll do that. So they throw him in a dry well. And then Reuben goes off somewhere, I don't know where. And while he's gone, Judah suggests, he sees a caravan coming by, and he suggests, wait, why leave him here? Let's sell him to this caravan as a slave. We'll make a little bit of money off of this, and then we'll take his coat and put blood on it and take it to our father. And so that's what they do. They sell Joseph into slavery, and then they put some blood on his coat, and they take it to Jacob, and they basically say, we don't know where Joseph is, but we found this coat, and do you know whose this is? It looks just like Jacob's. There's blood on it. So Jacob believes that his son Joseph is dead. He's been deceived by Joseph's brothers into doing that. And now here, the narrative, we have this chapter here where Joseph gets sold into slavery, and then usually when we're talking about the Genesis narrative, we just go right into him being in Egypt as a slave. But there's actually a little diversion here, and the next chapter is about Judah and Tamar. So Judah has 3 sons. The oldest is and he marries Tamar, but we don't know a whole lot about the details here, but the text does say that was wicked, and so the Lord slew him. So Tamar is a widow at this point. And there's something called the Levirate obligation. And that's where the husband's brother has the obligation to marry his brother's widow and raise children so that the husband's line is not lost. This is, in this culture, posterity was everything. The patriarch was the leader of the family, and um, children and posterity was basically the end all and be all, right? So dies without having any children, so it's the responsibility of his brother to give him the children he never had. So to marry his wife, and then his wife's children can propagate the line of the husband who died childless and take over his property and what have you. Now, until that happens, the property of the brother reverts back to the father's household. Um, And so that's what's going on here. And so Judah has his second son, Onan, marry Tamar. Now, Onan doesn't do his duty. The whole point of this marriage is for Tamar to have children so that Er's line doesn't die. But Onan intentionally prevents her from conceiving, and by doing that, he is no longer fulfilling the purpose of the Levirate institution, but he's basically placed his relationship with his sister-in-law in the category of incest, which is a capital offense. And no surprise, God kills Onan as well. So Judah starts with 3 sons. The first one marries Tamar, he dies. The second one marries Tamar, he dies. So Judah has 1 son left, but Shelah, his third son, is not old enough yet to marry Tamar. So Judah tells Tamar to return to the house of her father while waiting for Shelah to grow up. So Tamar is a widow, and she is living with her father. So she's kind of at a limited social status right now, while she waits for Sheila to get old enough to marry. But the issue here is that even though Sheila comes of age, Judah does not give him to Tamar. And then Judah's own wife dies, and there's a set time for mourning, and that time passes. And Judah is not fulfilling his duty to Tamar. And he takes, as it were, a business trip to a neighboring town. And Tamar hears about his trip. And she's tired of living in this kind of reduced social status as a widow. So she disguises herself. She goes and places herself in an area where she knows Judah will see her, and he does, and he propositions her, and she says, okay, but what will the payment be? He says, well, I'll give you, a kid from my flock or whatever, and she says, well, I need something now to prove that you'll give it to me. How about you give me your cord, your seal, and your staff, which is basically the equivalent of her saying, well, give me your wallet, your driver's license, and your social security card. That way, if you don't make good on your payment, I know who you are, and you can, I can come find you or whatever. So he does. He gives her that, and then she goes back home to her father. And when Judah sends his servant with the payment, the kid, in order to exchange it for this seal and cord and staff, the servant can't find her anywhere. And the men of the city say, we don't know who you're talking about. There's nobody that like that around here. So the incident is sort of forgotten. And then 3 months later, Tamar starts showing that she's pregnant. And Judah is pretty upset. And he says she needs to be put to death. So Judah sentences her to death. Now it's interesting here again, we saw the author using the same or similar phraseology talking about Laban deceiving Jacob as he did when he explained Jacob deceiving Isaac. And we see a similar thing going on here. So, Judah was the one who proposed to sell Joseph instead of killing him, and then kill a goat and dip Joseph's special coat in the blood, right? And when they present the coat to their father, what they say is more or less, please recognize this, whether it is Joseph's coat or not. But here, Judah, the deceiver in the previous story, has in turn been deceived. And when you read the text in the Hebrew, Tamar brings out, she's about to be burned, put to death, because Judah has sentenced her to that. And she brings out Judah's staff, seal, and cord and says, please recognize to whom these belong. So again, we're seeing a what goes around comes around kind of moral to this story, right? The same words that Judah used the Judah and his brothers used when they were executing Judah's idea to deceive their father are the words that Tamar is using um, when she's talking about the deception that she did to him. Now, um, it's important to recognize that the text uh, doesn't talk about this as an illicit affair, um, and it doesn't talk bad about their offspring. In fact, this is the line that the Savior comes through, right? Her actions were maybe unusual, but they were definitely not immoral by the laws and commandments and circumstances of her day. And Judah acknowledges all this when he says, "She hath been more righteous than I." So, in when you read this, considering the culture of the time and what was going on, Tamar is actually the heroine of this story. She had justifiably manipulated Judah into carrying out the responsibility he had shirked for many years. He had been depriving her in the process of children and of inheritance and of the opportunity to remarry. He had relegated her to kind of a second class tier of being a widow, a childless widow. And she saw this as a way to get out of that and to force his hand, which she did. And so, well, to us, in our modern culture with our ideas of morals and chastity and all of that, we may look at this and all we see is one small part of the story, the fact that she sat there as a prostitute. But in the story itself, when you look at the purpose of the story, that is kind of inconsequential. That's not something that the people of the time or the people, the authors who wrote it, would have wanted us to latch onto. There was more bigger things at play here. So after the story of Judah and Tamar, we then the text goes back into Joseph, who's in Egypt. He's been sold to Potiphar, um, who's in the courts of Pharaoh, and he becomes uh, kind of the leader of Potiphar's household, and God blesses him. God blesses Potiphar because Joseph is there, and he's so successful and he's so loyal that Potiphar gives him control over everything. When you read in Genesis, it even says that Potiphar doesn't know what he has. Joseph's in charge of everything, and Joseph is doing such a great job and is blessed by the Lord that Potiphar's wealth is expanding dramatically, and Potiphar doesn't know. He can't keep up with it. Doesn't know what he's got. But and it even says all he knows is that the food that's in front of him when he sits down to eat, he knows that's his. But other than that, he has no idea um, what is his or what's not. It's all he has trusted everything to Joseph. Um, but his wife, she decides she wants to lie with Joseph and repeatedly asks him and propositions him. And Joseph always turns her down. He always says no. But at one point they're alone and her advances become unavoidable. And this is where we get the title of the lesson. Joseph says, "How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And he flees, right? He runs away. She grabs onto his garment, claiming, and then uses that to claim that he had attacked her. And Joseph is sent to prison. While he's in prison, he interprets the dreams of Pharaoh's butler and baker, one being good news, one being bad news. But um, because of that, he ends up interpreting a dream for Pharaoh, and he's brought out of prison to work for Pharaoh, and he becomes the second in command and responsible for distributing grain during a time of intense famine. And during this time, Jacob sends his sons to Egypt to ask for grain. And when they get there, since Joseph is the one who's in charge, they have to go to him. But he conceals his identity, and they are deceived and don't know that it's their own brother that they are pleading with for food. So there's this trail of deception. This is kind of where the text ends for the lesson, but there's this trail of deception that we see through a couple of generations, right? Jacob deceives Isaac into thinking he's his twin brother Esau. He uses a goat, both the meat that Rebekah cooks for Isaac and the skin that he puts on his neck and arms, and then a cloth that smells like animals. And then Jacob is in turn deceived by his future father-in-law Laban as to his wife's identity, marrying Leah instead of Rachel first. And then Judah and his brothers deceive Jacob about Joseph's death, using a cloth torn from his garment and the blood of a goat. Jacob's son Judah is in turn deceived by his daughter-in-law Tamar about her identity, using a cloth and involving another animal for payment. Potiphar is deceived as to Joseph's intent by the misuse of a cloth garment. And then Judah and his brothers are later deceived by Joseph as to his identity, again by use of a cloth veil. So we just have this trail of deception. Just every turn here, somebody's being deceived. And a lot of times the authors tied it together by using the same words. Presumably they want us to recognize a theme that's common throughout the Bible. And in Galatians, they put it pretty succinctly. This says, "Be not deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." So, assuming, you're going to go off and deceive people, you can expect to be deceived yourself. Honesty is truly the best policy here. So, we're running a little short on time, maybe. So, in closing, I wanted to shift gears a little bit. This is, you know, this whole story has kind of focused on Jacob and Joseph. But next week is Easter. And while you look at this lesson in the lesson manual, and you look at what we're supposed to learn from it as we read the text, and you look at pretty much most of Christianity, and when they're reading these chapters in Genesis, what they talk about, Joseph is often viewed solely as an example of moral fortitude in the face of temptation and despair, right? He has a pretty good life growing up. He's his father's favorite son, but then things go south. He gets thrown in a well. He gets sold as a slave. He ends up in prison, and he has these highs and lows. He's very well taken care of by his father, and then he's a slave, and then he becomes Potiphar's head of household, and then he goes to prison, and then he becomes the right-hand man for Pharaoh, right? And so you have these dramatic swings of things going good for him, things going bad for him, and yet through it all, he never complains. He's always righteous. He's got this moral fortitude in the face of temptation, Potiphar's wife, and in the face of wealth and everything else. Like and when he's in prison, and he's a great example for that. And that's what we tend to latch on to when we talk about Joseph now. But in the British Library is a 5th century Syriac manuscript, and it contains details of the lectionary readings of Old and New Testament passages for religious services. And if you look at the ones for Easter, prominently featured among the Old Testament readings prescribed for Easter is excerpts from the story of Joseph. In early Syriac Christianity, Joseph was seen first and foremost as a type of Christ, which greatly affected their retelling of the story, right? Whereas we latch on to his moral fortitude and his perseverance and his good attitude and whatever else we latch on to, early Christianity, maybe not so much. I mean, that was there, sure, but they looked at him and saw Christ. They saw a type of Christ. And there are, there's lots of valuable lessons and applications to Joseph's life story, but there's a prophetic aspect to the account that foreshadows the Messiah himself. There's a lot of parallels between Joseph and Jesus. You can get online and people have made charts of this. There's more than 100 different points that people have come up with. I've got a sheet front and back of some of them that's in with the download on the for this lesson, but it's got 3 columns, similarities in the left, and then Joseph and Jesus and scriptures that go through it. And it talks about some of the similarities between Joseph and Jesus. We'll just talk about a couple here. Um, Jacob's beloved son Joseph, his firstborn by Rachel, is sent out to retrieve his brothers and is hated and betrayed by them, right? Just like Jesus, the firstborn and beloved of the Father, is sent to retrieve his brothers, us. And what happens? He's hated and betrayed by his brothers. Um, Joseph is tempted but does not sin. Now, interesting on this one, when you read the Genesis account in the Bible, all we have is 3 words from Potiphar's wife: lie with me, right? That's all she says: lie with me. But if you read some of the other accounts earlier, she's a little bit more sophisticated in her temptations. One of them says, reports her as saying, "Hear me, Joseph, because I love you, and accept my advice and carry out my desire, and let not your heart quake because of Potiphar, for I can kill him quickly with poison. Now instead of a servant, be a king and lord of the house. Lie with me, Joseph, and carry out my will, and don't be afraid, and be mine, and I and whatsoever belongs to me is yours." So when you listen to that, what Potiphar's wife is promising him, what? Glory, dominion, kingship, very similar to the temptations that Jesus went through in the New Testament. Both of them pass, of course, with flying colors. Joseph is accused and condemned on false charges in Genesis 39, and Jesus ends up on the cross through the same way. Joseph is raised up to the right hand of Pharaoh, and as predicted, the people bow the knee to him, and he becomes the savior to all the earth, all the known earth at the time. Jesus the same way. And then finally, Joseph forgives his sinful brothers and restores them, making them citizens of his kingdom. And that is what Jesus does for us. So as Easter is coming up, and you're, in the mindset of that, look at Joseph. Look at the story of Joseph again. See how many parallels you can pull out, because Joseph was one of the Easter stories that was used in early Christianity.